for both of us, this trade issue has been central in our work. And my concern goes back now 40 years. And it is so exciting to see what you've accomplished, to within 2 years get 600 organizations together and to have almost 3.3 million people signing on to their opposition to these trade treaties. I mean, this is particularly against TTIP, and it's one of the biggest, one of the most important. And you're saying, and you'll tell us more about it, that it looks like people power is finally winning out. And I do want people to be aware that this whole process of trade treaties, which started already back when the World Bank and the IMF were set up with something called the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, this has been the big dark secret whereby banks and corporations have ended up ruling our governments. Behind the scenes, unnamed corporations have been running the show. And now finally people are really waking up. For me, it's the most central, the most important shift to start getting power back to the people. And then, of course, I just quickly want to add for the listeners that we in my organizations have simultaneously been encouraging people to start rebuilding their local economies from the bottom up. And we need both of these. We need to work at the global level and at the local level. So Stephanie, please tell us about how you've managed to do this and how you see what's happening.
Okay. So hi everybody, and thank you, Helena, for this lovely introduction. I hope you can hear me well, not too loud. So first,
I hear you perfectly.
Good. First, on trade. I think trade is a very important thing. I mean, if we look at the history of mankind, they have always traded and exchanged goods. But there's trade and there's trade. And the trade agreements that you have been describing now are really mega trade agreements. And we can see that also with TTIP and CETA. And even those who negotiate these trade agreements say that there are winners and they are losers. And I don't agree to have trade when there are winners and losers. Usually when you trade, people exchange things and both sides are happy. And this is where, I think this is where the injustice starts. And I think that many people are seeing these things. And if today so many people signed the European Citizens Initiative against TTIP and CETA, the 3.4 million people, and if so many organizations are joining the call to stop TTIP and CETA, then it is because I think many people have understood the injustice that is at the core of these agreements. It's nothing to do with lowering barriers or creating jobs, as the proponents claim. It really is a huge deregulation agenda, and we can talk about this later. And if so many people have joined, then it is not that we are doing great work. We are just providing the tools for citizens all around the world to express themselves. And so these 3.4 million people have really come together by the people themselves. And for me, this is the most beautiful thing about the work that we are doing here, that we can see that people are rising and they are refusing to accept this injustice any longer. And it's wonderful to see the people power is working.
Yes, and finally, after some dismal years, and we have to be sure that this really moves ahead to really transform things. But can you also spell out more what CETA means and what it's actually about, and TTIP for us?
Mm-hmm. So
first of all, TTIP stands for the
TTIP stands for the Transatlantic Trade Agreement. It's a free trade agreement between the United States and Europe, and it aims to be a free trade agreement. Mr. Obama very much would like to conclude it within his administration, to take it with him as a legacy, if you want. But the problem with TTIP is that it has been negotiated in secrecy, and that when people started to find out about it, they insisted to know more about it. And so perhaps you have heard about the leaks, the TTIP leaks recently by Greenpeace. And there were other leaks before. I mean, it's very sad nowadays that if we want to learn more about the trade agreements that affect us, that we have to turn to sources like WikiLeaks to find out about them. I mean, you would presume that a government that claims transparency and all these nice principles, that they would make these agreements available, ever more so if they are good. I mean, if they are good, why should you hide them? But yeah, so our modern democracy makes us turn to sources like WikiLeaks to find out about them. And once people found out about them, and once people found out what was written and what was negotiated, this is really when they turned into opposing these trade deals. So TTIP is this trade deal between the EU and the US, and then we have CETA, which is the sister of TTIP, and CETA is a comprehensive economic trade agreement. That's what it stands for, and it is negotiated between Europe and Canada. And yeah, these are these.
But as we were saying the other day, it's actually it's actually really the U.S. again pushing, and you know, very much part of that going through Canada, isn't it?
Yes, both Canada and the United States have strong cooperations. They work together on regulatory matters, but yeah, also on investment and trade. So, yeah.
And I think, you know, for people, you know, the idea that trade is being deregulated really sounds quite harmless. But actually what's going on is that, and it's been going on for a long time, but it's getting worse and worse. And that is that companies like Monsanto, Goldman Sachs, this is about banks and other corporations. It's also about media conglomerates. So these enormous giants are essentially bullying governments to say, give us more freedom, deregulate, remove regulations that in any way can impede our profit. And they are pushing governments to sign in black and white, if we do anything that might reduce your potential profit-making potential, you can sue us. So it is the most unbelievable rejection of democracy. It is really a situation that I am convinced the majority of humanity would absolutely reject. You know, we're talking about a Swedish nuclear power company suing Germany for, I think it was 3.7 billion euros, because Germany decided the people wanted to go away from nuclear power to renewable energy. So a nuclear power company sues Germany saying, oh, we were going to make a lot of money out of nuclear power in Germany, and now you're preventing it, so give us 3.7 billion euros. France was sued for wanting to increase its minimum wage. So it is such an outrage, and these clauses are called ISDS, so you may be hearing about them. That stands for Investor-State Dispute Settlement. And maybe you have some more examples of those, Stephanie.
So both the CETA agreement and TTIP include ISDS, or State Investor Dispute Settlement, which is this private arbitration mechanisms. So parties to such arbitration less discuss laws, but more try to find a settlement between arguments. And you have this both in TTIP and CETA. But Helena already mentioned some of the cases where companies are suing governments for enormous amounts of money if they see their profits threatened by environmental legislation that has come into force, or any kind of legislation that could threaten their profits. I mean, the Vattenfall case that Helena mentioned is in reaction to Germany, the German government deciding to turn off nuclear power stations in Germany. So that's a very good law for environmental protection and human health protection, people would claim. But nonetheless, this is why Vattenfall is suing the German government at the moment. And there are many cases like this, particularly in Eastern Europe. And what is so perverse about it is that companies are using ISDS just to propose crazy projects, which they know they might never get approved, but they know that they can't lose because they have ISDS. They can sue just in case their crazy projects don't get approved. But worse still, with ISDS, we have something new. It's called, that is coming out, it's called a regulatory chill. What happens is that the mere threat of a company being able to sue a government is already discouraging governments to put into place laws that protect people and the environment. And let me give you an example. At the moment, the government of Romania is considering to ban the use of cyanide in mining. Cyanide is one of the most toxics known to man. I mean, a spoonful of a 2% cyanide solution is enough to kill a person. I mean, it was used in the concentration camps during the Second World War. It is also used in mining. And Romania, the Romanian government wants to ban cyanide-based mining, but it is extremely scared that it might get sued by the Canadian companies, mining companies that want to invest in Romania. And at the moment, it is hesitating to implement a law that would be good for people and for the environment, just because they are afraid that they might get sued under an ISDS case. And this is called regulatory chill, when ISDS is stopping governments from enacting good laws.
Yeah. And this is the most unbelievable situation, that, you know, a company on the other side of the world has so much power over your health, your environment. And this is crisscrossing across the world. It's affecting Australians, Americans, in every country. Our governments have quietly handed over the power to corporations and banks on the other side of the world. And many people might think that because the US government is so actively and heavily promoting these trade treaties, that it would be benefiting America. But no, it's not benefiting the American people. This is a crazy, mad, theoretical idea about more global trade, more freedom for global trade, always being better. And that means that the US government is supporting the creation of billionaires in China, in Malaysia, in Mexico, and impoverishing its own people. In fact, we are now, I feel one of the hopeful things about the situation we're in now is that this system has become so destructive for the vast majority of people that we really have to say that, you know, if we're already at a point where 62 people own more wealth than half the global population. Now, how can this continue? It's actually good news for us that 99% of humanity is losing out on this game. It means that we are crazy if we don't simply reclaim the power. And it needs to be, you know, from our point of view, it needs to be accompanied by a systemic, a holistic understanding of what it is we want in a systemic form, not just a rejection of the current order. We also think it's extremely important that we look at this in a calm and composed way. We don't need to enrage ourselves. We don't need hatred. We don't need any form of violence. We need calm, collected, clear, rational thinking to reject a crazy system. But I do want to add here that a concomitant of this, something that has accompanied this process for several decades now, is that at the same time that Coca-Cola, Monsanto, these giant corporations have lobbied government to give them more freedom, they have also lobbied government to over-regulate local and national businesses. We have had, in the name of health and public safety, nonsensical regulations being brought in. We have had local governments using our tax money to over-regulate, even inside our own homes. If we want to build a cupboard virtually, we end up spending taxpayers' money to over-regulate ourselves while using our taxes to subsidize these giant global corporations who or which do not pay tax. So in this climate, the sad thing that's happening is that many people at the local level who don't see this global game, who don't understand this trade scenario, end up furious at government. They're incensed by some of the stupid, meaningless regulations, and they say, we don't want government. Laissez-faire economics. Give us free trade. Give us free economics. Because they haven't understood the bigger picture, and they haven't realized that the destructive side of big government has to do with the fact that they are servants to big business. So the real problem is big business. The real problem is not government. And we just need clarity about this to see that we need to strengthen our national government's ability to re-regulate global trade while we simultaneously lobby them to decentralize economic power and even political power so that more of the regulation can be done at a local level with much more accountable and visible structures. But the key thing I hope people will remember is that the sort of Trump mentality, the xenophobia that's growing, the fear of the outsiders, the prejudice, and much of the violence that's growing is actually a consequence of this over-regulation at the local level, the unemployment, the destruction of culture, identity, and security is leading to increased violence and increased craziness, a la Trump being one of the main examples. I presume, Stephanie, that you agree with that. Even, I'd love to hear more from.
Yeah, I agree that, one of the things that is very saddening is that the income gap between rich and poor is widening and widening, and it's creating huge inequality. And within that huge widening of the income gap, you have incredible, powerful companies that are still trying to widen that income gap. At the same time, I agree with you that people have an incredible power. I really believe in citizens' power because we still have the right to vote, and we can still take this destiny in our hands. And I think that people can make a difference, and they need to fight for what they believe in. Each generation is faced with challenges, and maybe this is one of the challenges of our generation. And we need to, together, we need to take this into our hands, and we need to go to our governments, and we need to protest. We need to take all the means that we can, and apart from violence, of course, but all the creative and good means that we can to say this is not what we want. And for some people who want to work on this, to say what they want. But I really believe that people are the solution to this problem. Because also when you do your shopping, to buy your milk or to buy your bread nowadays is not shopping. It is also a political decision. You can choose to whom you want to give your money when you buy a liter of milk. If you want to give it to a big company, or if you want to encourage your local producer. And I think that this is already where change is starting, and this is already where we can see change. And I think that's good, and more of this needs to happen.
Although I think you also agree that we need to vote also, we need actually to have our voices heard to make changes in the rules in the global economy. And that we can do with our vote, not just with our shopping habits.
That's right. That's right.
And I think that the what's so exciting is that we have this coming together. For us, in our organization, we've been promoting this shift from global to local now for a long time. And there have been, it's been slow. I mean, there was a time when I used to talk about these trade treaties and people would just glaze over. They just weren't interested. And it's been a remarkable shift in the last couple of years. And I think we should reflect on the fact that Bernie Sanders talking about these trade treaties is a remarkable phenomenon, that it shows that the people power, particularly a lot of young people in the US, have got onto this issue. He's made it a central campaign issue, even to the point where Hillary Clinton now has had to express her doubts about these treaties. We need to be clear that if she gets into power, she will turn around and ratify them. But it's a very, very significant phenomenon that Bernie Sanders has had so much support, and I hope that people will take heart in this, even if he doesn't win. What it shows is that people are waking up to the central issues shaping our planet, shaping our world. And I just want to add that Stephanie was talking about the gap between rich and poor, which in every country is increasing. Job insecurity, financial insecurity, increasing in every country, and it's trickling upwards, so that even in the middle classes, even in the upper middle classes, people are finding themselves more financially insecure, and it's more difficult for young people to find jobs. By the way, the enormous stress on young people, huge competition at university, huge debt to pay for studying, more and more of it is privatized, and then in the workplace, such intense competition. All of this is leading to an epidemic of anxiety, depression, suicide at increasing rates, literally worldwide. South Korea is probably where the statistics are most alarming, but if you look carefully, you will see it's on the increase. This is depressing, but it is not depressing that people are beginning to wake up to the need to look at the economic system, not to blame themselves, not to think that they're simply not up to the task. Now, the other side of this, the social destruction is massive. On the other side, we have, with these giant corporations, we have a huge increase in resource and energy consumption. Most people don't know that through these global trade treaties, we have the madness of countries importing and exporting the same products. The US exporting about 100,000 tons of beef, turning around and importing about 100,000 tons of beef. The UK exporting as much milk and butter as it imports. You also have companies flying fish from Norway to be deboned in China, shrimp from England to be peeled in Thailand, apples to be washed in South Africa, flown back. All of that silent flying and transporting in huge lorries and huge container ships back and forth is the main reason, not only for climate change, but for toxicity, extinction of species. So the major reason behind climate change is not whether you change your light bulbs or how much you drive your car. The main reason has to do with the production side. Where are we producing? Did any one of us ask our government to have all our clothes, all our shoes, all our light bulbs, all our everything produced in China? No, because by shifting all of that production, we were also losing our jobs. It makes sense to bring the economy home and for most countries to produce most of their needs and to trade where things cannot be produced locally or nationally. Stephanie, have you got examples about that from Romania or Germany,
Yes.
where you're living now?
Yeah, I want to start with a far more general picture. Just try to close your eyes and try to imagine for a moment a global economy without the transport that we have at the moment that depends on fossil fuel. It would mean that tomorrow there would be no trade, no nothing. You would not have your milk, you would not have your butter, you would probably not have most of the things that you get every day if you imagine for a day if you wouldn't have fossil fuel to fuel the economy. Yet at the same time, the decision makers say that something needs to be done against climate change, and they have signed the Paris Agreement. And we know that climate change is very real, and sea levels are rising, and politicians know that too, and they also know that it's driven by CO2, and and you can't have both. So this is the eternal dilemma that they are faced with, and of course it's a very unpopular, or maybe that's what it's still at the moment. It's a very unpopular election slogan to be campaigning against climate change. I think change is coming now with people like perhaps also Bernie Sanders, but we can also see changes here in Europe of these issues that a couple of years ago were still a taboo, that they are now being addressed in the political agenda, but still no politician will hope to get elected because of his message on climate change, unfortunately. But it will be about job and growth and these kinds of things. And this also explains their adherence to free trade treaties such as TTIP and CETA. But I really think, listening to you just now, Helena, I was thinking back when we met many, many years ago at the office of Teddy Goldsmith. And he gave me a book to read. It was The Case Against the Global Economy and For a Turn Towards the Local. And I still think that this is one of the most up-to-date and clear books on that subject. And I think that nowadays, with the latest economic crash that we had, that people have understood that if you have strong local economies, then something like a global economic crash cannot happen, because if you have strong local economies, then each of these strong local economies act as a bulwark to stop an economic recession from the neighbor or something like this. And this is why I agree with you that we need to have strong local economies. So if you haven't read, for all of you who are participating in this call, if you haven't read this book called The Case Against the Global Economy and For a Turn Towards the Local, I can highly recommend it to you. It changed my view on many things, and it explained things really well and plain. So go and get it.
I'm so glad, and we really should bring it back again, because you're right, there hasn't really been anything since then. And I was involved at the very beginning. I introduced Teddy to Doug Tompkins. I organized a meeting in Sweden which brought them together and introduced Doug Tompkins to Vandana Shiva and to some of the main people. And that was in 92, I think 91 or 92. And that was really the background for this forum on globalization. And what I think happened in the meanwhile is that whether through corporate neoliberal think tanks or just circumstances, the drama of terrorism, the drama of climate change arose as single issues that took away the focus that we had been able to generate, because we had had because of, I mentioned Doug Tompkins and Teddy Goldsmith, they both had foundations that were able to fund the work that allowed about 40 of us to meet from all around the world, from virtually every continent, over many years, to look at the impact of these trade treaties around the world. And then we organized big conferences, particularly in the United States, but also in some other countries. And we helped to bring all those people to Seattle. But after that, as I say, the threat of terrorism, the threat of climate change emerged as single issues. The meeting in Rio, which was funded by big corporations, maybe not through ill will. I knew some of the people who organized that conference, like Maurice Strong. Their concern about the environment led to giant corporations funding some of these big environmental meetings and later on big environmental organizations. And basically, the last thing they were going to look at was the problem with giant global corporations and banks gaining more and more power. Instead, the focus was, as I say, on climate change, on biodiversity loss, on later on terrorism. But now again, we're coming back to seeing if we don't make changes to this crazy economic system, we are not only driving up CO2 emissions, creating insecurity, violence, and friction, but we are also destroying jobs systematically. So this is our job now. We have got to put this message out because our politicians, as you were saying, Stephanie, keep telling us we've got to have global growth in order to create jobs. Got to have global growth to create jobs. What does it mean to tell us we have got to open up the door so that everything we need comes from somewhere else? How are we going to create jobs in that way? In their mindset, in their patriarchal, reductionist, removed, theoretical frames that really don't touch the ground, they believe now that we've got to create more technology in order to create more jobs. Any child would recognize that technology is there to relieve us of work. It's actually there to replace human labor and increasingly human intelligence. So please don't tell us that we're going to create more technology to create more jobs, or that we need more global growth to create more jobs. So there is this discussion going on now. There's a new economy movement emerging. There's a very powerful localization movement emerging. And I hope that, I think we're going to need to move on to questions soon, but I hope that our listeners will help us to develop these things more. Stephanie, do you want to say something before we turn over to questions?
Let's open the floor for questions. That would be great.
All right.
Okay.
Can you hear me again?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Yeah, we have a couple questions already. So let's see. First question is, isn't one of the corporate leviathans that you've been talking about suing Peru under an existing ISDS law? Do either of you know anything about that?
Just give me a second.
I have heard something like that, but I don't remember the details.
Yep. I mean, there are ISDS cases almost all around the world already. But the problem with TTIP and CETA is that they would increase these ISDS cases 1,000-fold. So to give you an example, only if we have only by CETA, the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, we can get there would be 41,000 US companies that have a letterbox in Canada that would be able to sue EU governments, and that's just US companies with a letterbox in Canada. So just imagine the sheer amount of companies that would be able to sue under these new free trade agreements. So we are talking about an exponential, about a crazy increase. But let me just pull up the the ISDS case with the Republic of Peru and its Renko group. I need to look at it at the moment. Hang on. So if
maybe we can take another question in the meantime.
Yeah, for sure. So another question is, this is to Stephanie. Will the proposed Trade Secrets Protection Act affect whistleblowers on trade negotiations?
I didn't hear the question.
Oh, okay. So one more time, it's will the proposed Trade Secrets Protection Act affect whistleblowers on trade negotiations?
Well, there has been lots of whistleblowing, but the treaty is not in yet. It's a very good question, actually. I'm sure it would try, but yeah, like I said, the whistleblowers are the ones who have leaked what we know, most of what we know now, and civil disobedience is a virtue.
Also, by the way, we have, so Stephen, who asked the question, the first question about the case in Peru, says that it might have been Monsanto suing over a Peruvian law requiring GMO labeling on foods.
Okay.
So, yeah, I guess if you're ready to take another question, there's another one already in. So, Stephanie mentioned that, so this is the question, I'll just read it. Stephanie mentioned that part of her work in opposing TTIP was providing citizens with tools for expression. What are these tools you are providing citizens to oppose the TTIP?
So, there are many tools to express. Some of them are online, and some of them are offline. One of the tools that we used at the beginning to mobilize people and to inform people about the threats of TTIP and CETA was to start what is called a European Citizens Initiative. It is a tool that allows citizens in Europe to collect signatures, and if they have 1 million signatures from many different EU member states, you need to reach certain quorums, then you can go with your petition to the parliament and you get a hearing in the parliament. And this is one of the tools that we used to raise public awareness on TTIP and CETA and to get lots of people to hear about it. And people could sign online via our website, but they could also sign offline. And what happened was that citizens from everywhere in Europe over the weekend or during the week when they had time, they would go into the streets and would collect signatures and they would explain to the people the threats of TTIP and CETA. So this is one tool. The other tool is, of course, that we help organize demonstrations, big demonstrations like you had in Berlin with 250,000 people last year, and just now one in Hanover with 90,000 people when Barack Obama came and visited Germany. And we think a demonstration is also a very important tool because when you have a demonstration, it brings people together, they rally together and they talk about this problem, TTIP or CETA, but at the same time, usually you have a program when you have a demonstration and you will invite speakers, and these speakers usually are people from very different backgrounds, like it could be somebody working on environmental issues, it could be a union, a person from a union, and they all make speeches and they explain why they are against TTIP, and this in return disseminates information and helps people to stand up against TTIP by signing our online or offline petitions, etc., etc. So these are some of the tools. And just now, I mean, if you look at the Stop TTIP movement, it has been really very creative in what it has done. We have, for example, something called TTIP-free zones. And it's when local villages or local towns or local municipalities or big towns declare themselves TTIP-free. And so it's citizens. They submit a motion to their local town hall, and then the town hall votes on this motion, and it declares itself TTIP or CETA free. And you might think that this is certainly not important. You might think that this is perhaps only symbolic, but it is also very important because municipalities and may play a really important role in feeding back politics to the central level. And so if the party line here is that in Germany now we have, I don't know, 150 big towns that are TTIP and CETA free, this is really a manifestation. So this is another way of showing, of giving tools how to oppose TTIP and CETA. And last but not least, there is another one which I think is very good. The European Commission is saying all the time that TTIP will benefit small business, small and medium enterprises. And many small and medium enterprises disagree because they think that they will be unable to compete with their products if you have more imports that are coming in either from the United States or CETA from Canada. And so what you have now is you have big campaigns that are started by small and medium-sized bosses of enterprises that say, we are against TTIP, we are against CETA. And this is really important because it shows powerful businesses saying no to these free trade agreements. And you have, for example, a website, it's called Business Against TTIP. You can do a Google. It's the English version of it. It's very good. It will show you the UK-based small businesses that are against TTIP and CETA, and it has some really big names. You know, you have Lush, you have Vivian Westwood, you have Patagonia, and you know these are important. This is strong pressure on the European Commission because this is business. These are the people who it says it defends. So these are a couple of these tools. I hope it's helpful.
Yeah, very helpful. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Before I forget, I do also want to mention to particularly anyone who's listening from Australia that the TTP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is completely parallel to what we're talking about with TTIP, which is essentially between the US and Europe. TPP is US and China and Australia and the Pacific countries. And everything we're saying about TTIP and CETA applies to TPP. And I also wanted to say, Stephanie, you have also done a lot of work in farming. And you, I'm sure, agree that we're seeing around the world the strongest resistance to these trade treaties has always come from small farmers because they have been witnessing how they're destroyed by these treaties, which is why one of the biggest social movements in the world was set up. It's called Via Campesina, which means the way of the farmer. And it's a network of several 100 million small farmers from around the world who have joined together in opposition to these trade treaties. And with in your work in Romania and so on, you must have seen the impact on small farmers.
Yeah, I just wanted to say farming, the impact of TTIP on farming here in the EU will be considerable. And luckily there are some very good organizations that have been mapping this and analyzing this. And one of these organizations is actually a US-based organization. It's the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. And if you go on their website, they have a very good brief. It says 10 reasons why TTIP is bad for good food and good farming. And I can recommend it to any one of you. It's just a short overview that explains very clearly the impact of TTIP on food and farming. And just to give you one example that really is important here to the EU, in European legal practice and law, we have something called the precautionary principle. Civil society has fought very hard to make sure that this principle is enshrined as a legal principle. What it means is that you first need to prove that a product that you want to use is harmful. You need to prove that it's not harmful, sorry. You need to prove that it's not harmful, and only then you can use it. The United States has a science-based approach. and it works different. And the United States wants to make sure that TTIP will see the science-based approach being used in the EU under TTIP. And this is one of the reasons why so many farmers and people who care about good food and good farming are opposed to this. Because, for example, in the EU, growth promoters in meat are not allowed, but they are allowed in the US. And also the US legal provision on antibiotics EU. And we think that although the one in the EU is not as perfect as maybe the Danish example is always the best one, but still the precautionary principle is very important in this respect. And for example, in the United States, you can produce milk from cloned animals, and this is something that is forbidden in the EU. And it is very clear from the negotiations that the agricultural sector is a very important sector for the US because it has a trade deficit, and it wants to eliminate this trade deficit via TTIP. And they will make sure that US dairy products and farming products will be able to come onto the EU market. And to make sure that they can come onto the EU market, you need to eliminate the trade barriers that are stopping these products from entering the EU market now.
So do we want to take another question?
Go ahead.
Yes.
Okay. So a lot of abbreviations in this one. The question is, does the new ICS system that is replacing the ISDS courts mean that SPD MEPs will now accept CETA and TTIP?
That's a very good question. Do you want me to take it?
Yeah, sure. And maybe you could just say
please.
for what each of those.
What the abbreviation
Yeah.
So ISDS is the classic is the classic dispute settlement system, and when the public started to shout out against TTIP and ISDS, the European Commission did something called a consultation. They asked people what they think about ISDS. And they got back an incredible amount of people. I think it was 14,000 people, of which 97% said that they don't want ISDS in TTIP or in any trade agreement. And the EU Commission, being the EU Commission, which is sometimes very cynical, what they did, instead of taking ISDS out of TTIP, they invented a new form of ISDS called ICS. So ICS is an updated version of ISDS. We call it ISDS Lite, and they hoped that they hope that if they say ICS, everybody would love and accept it. But the contrary happened. But what happened was that the socialist faction in the European Parliament was very much behind promoting this ICS dispute settlement. And that's why that's where this question comes from. The question asks whether we think that with the new ICS, the Social Democrats will vote for TTIP. And my answer to that is that they have many. My answer to that would be that there was a TTIP resolution passed, and in that TTIP resolution, members of the European Parliament very clearly marked the red lines on TTIP. The red lines are no-nos, are very strong no-nos, and there are many more reasons why TTIP should not be voted for by S&D parliamentarians according to their own red lines. So it's not only ICS, but there are many other things why they should not be voting for TTIP. but I also hope that with more and more public opposition manifesting itself against ICS, that the socialists in the European Parliament will start to analyze it more, and will see that if you just make some kind of cosmetic makeover, that this does not resolve the real issue underneath. And this is what ICS is all about. It's just a cosmetic makeup of ISDS. The reform is only procedural, but it doesn't at all, how should we say, resolve the problems that civil society and people have against ISDS.
So we're actually out of questions right now, so if you have any other things that you wanted to talk about but didn't have time for earlier, while we wait for maybe some more questions to come in, feel free to talk about them now, if there's anything that you feel like wasn't covered enough.
Yeah, I would like to give 10 reasons against TTIP. I mean, we've talked about TTIP now, and we've talked about some of the ingredients, but I just want to reiterate why TTIP is bad, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah? So first of all, first reason, TTIP is bad for democracy, because if TTIP is agreed, it would give the power to corporations to sue governments, and that would harm our public interest, and it would harm democracy. That's the first reason to be against TTIP. The second reason to be against TTIP is that TTIP is a threat to public services, because TTIP will create new markets in public services such as health and education, and it would lead to greater liberalization and privatization, and it would make it very difficult to bring these services back to private if ever we decide of wanting to do this in the future, because there are things embedded in TTIP called ratchet clause, which makes it impossible once you have liberalized the public service to make it private again. And then we have already touched on the fact that TTIP is a threat to food safety. In Europe, people are, like I said, I mentioned the precautionary principle, but people are scared also about GMOs and things like this being able to enter the European market far easily. TTIP is a threat to the environment. I mentioned the example of Romania and the ban on cyanide, but it would also mean that maybe EU legislation on the environment would be reduced to US levels, and this is also one of the reasons why people oppose TTIP here in Europe. Because, for example, we don't want to have a US-style fracking boom in Europe. TTIP is also a threat to workers' rights, because the US does not accept the ILO Convention on labor standards and issues like child labor. Lots of people say that TTIP is a threat also to personal privacy, because we know from leaked documents that the US wants to reintroduce elements of the ACTA agreement that was so successfully stopped at the EU level. And many people also think that TTIP is a threat to financial control, because it would remove much of the regulations that have been introduced since 2008 to prevent a future crash. And I think one of the reasons that many people hate TTIP, to say it like this, is that TTIP was negotiated in secrecy, and this creates uneasiness about something, and if something is good, then we should talk about it and not keep it in secret. So these are, yeah, and another important aspect that Helena also raised to a certain extent, that TTIP is a very bad blueprint for the rest of the world, because if agreed, then countries in the South would be under huge pressure to adjust their markets to the countries that are regulated by TTIP, if you want. So, yeah, these are 10 reasons why to oppose TTIP.
And I think we should also mention that, in fact, after 2008, governments did not regulate enough the banking sector, the finance sector. And it was so obvious in that crash that we desperately need regulation, not deregulation. Again, only with a strong people's movement will we start getting the type of regulation we need. We urgently need to demand new treaties that have exactly the opposite effect. Collaboration between countries to take on these enormous banks and corporate giants. We are, I think, not understanding what's happening through deregulation. The deregulation is what has allowed banks to create more and more money out of essentially thin air. We're giving banks the right to create money as debt, and the proportion of money that has been created in that way has ballooned into roughly $250 billion circulating the world looking for quick profit. Now that quick profit demands giant monocultural, monolithic corporations that can provide quick and large-scale profit. These large giants can't deal with the small, can't deal with diversity. And so we have almost like a machine now, deregulated money, supporting the media conglomerates and the giant corporations that, you know, whether it's in the pharmaceutical industry, whether it's in the sugar industry, which we're hearing more and more about in terms of our health, whether it's in the education industry, where we're hearing more and more about the disasters going on, are continuing to fuel and move all of society in a direction that really nobody wants. So I think it's really important that we look at this bigger picture to understand the basic, the central key role of what it would mean to shift away from global giants to more localized, place-based businesses. Localized doesn't mean that we're going to be manufacturing bicycles or whatever else we want at some kind of village level. It simply means that every business, every bank needs to belong to a place, needs to be localized, needs to adhere to the rules determined by that society, that people have to be able to have an oversight of the businesses that so profoundly influence their lives. And so localization is not about ending trade, it's not about reverting to tiny villages. It is about place-based business. And when it comes to food and farming, when it comes to primary production, a great degree of decentralization or localization makes sense. When it comes to industry, there is an efficiency of scale, so there we wouldn't decentralize quite so much. I hope all of that makes sense. And I think we should probably draw to a close. Sean, what do you say?
Well, there's actually another question that just came in.
Okay.
And yeah, and we do still have about 20 minutes left of the time that we scheduled the webinar to go. So if you guys are okay answering another question.
Yeah.
All right.
Sure.
So the question is, can you tell us about the alternative trade mandate and why that's mentioned so little?
It's a very good question. I don't know much about it. So I can't tell you much about it. I agree, it's mentioned very little. Even I, who work on TTIP, I don't know much about it. But that's just because my energy, I don't have time to deal with it. But maybe Helena knows about it.
No, actually, I can't think now where it. I'm familiar with the term, but I can't think where it comes from. Maybe the person who asked the question can tell us where it comes from.
There is they have a website. It's called the alternativeTradeMandate.org, and it's very good. I've seen it several times, but I haven't gone into it in depth. It says trade isn't working, there's an alternative, can help us get there, learn more about us. And yeah, it's a European movement, and they have MEPs that are supporting their trade agenda. It's a good question. I don't know enough about it. Yeah.
Any other final comments, I guess? Maybe we'll wait another 5 minutes or so to see if any more questions come in, and you guys can both give some final thoughts.
Yeah, I just wanted to give some some references to organizations that are doing really great work on TTIP related issues. So
yeah, that would be very, very helpful.
Okay. So there is an organization called Corporate Europe Observatory, and you can Google all these organizations and it should come up. The Corporate Europe Observatory is possibly one of the groups that I think does brilliant work. What they do is they follow and they monitor and they assess the power of lobby on policies. And they do this in particular for the EU. And they have done very interesting research on who the lobby companies are that put pressure on the EU Commission to drop this or that chapter in TTIP, to drop the precautionary principle, to weaken pesticide rules, to weaken air quality directives. So who are these companies? And of course, these are companies that think that they will have the greatest benefit out of it. And the Corporate Europe Observatory really evidences this. It shows you they had so and so many meetings with the EU Commission, they paid so and so much money for publicity, for advertisement, etc., etc. So if you want to know more about the impact that big corporations or big business has on politics and policy, then go and visit the Corporate Europe Observatory. As I mentioned before, on farming, farming is really an issue that is important, not just on the EU side, but there are also very good reasons why US farmers should think whether TTIP is such a good deal for them after all. And there I mentioned before the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. They are in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So if food and farming is something that interests you, then check out these guys.
Actually, I've just looked at this alternative trade mandate, and I think it looks very interesting. It's similar to the sort of things that we've been recommending, which is precisely that we need international collaboration to start framing the type of re-regulation that we need. And they make a particular point of being committed to supporting and protecting small farmers, which is of fundamental importance worldwide, because it's small-scale, diversified agriculture that is actually more productive, more sustainable than giant monocultures. Big farms linked to the big supermarkets have never actually produced more food per acre than smaller diversified farms. What they've done is to be efficient by producing more food with fewer jobs. They were able to eliminate people from the equation, use lots of fossil fuels, both for chemicals and for machines, and the efficiency was that, eliminating human beings from the equation, but not more efficient in terms of producing more food. So small diversified farms are important. I really like the look of this alternative trade mandate, and I thank the person who brought the question and brought it, forced me to look at it more carefully. It's just one of so many examples of what's happening. You know, we're promoting these alternatives. We're working, broadly with this localization, and we are every day surprised by the number of initiatives we've never heard of. I hope that those of you who are listening take heart in this silent revolution of people waking up and starting to demand something else, and not just demand, but actually starting to work practically to build something else. There is so much more out there demonstrating that people want something else, that there is good motivation. We are not greedy, selfish people, by nature. There's a lot of goodwill, there's a lot of wisdom, and so much more happening than any of us realize.
We actually have a few more last-minute questions come in, so I think if you're all right with that, I'm going to just dive into them. Yeah. So this one's very interesting. What are the real differences between the TTIP and already existing WTO general agreements like the Doha round?
Well, it's simply that through the WTO they were trying to create these umbrella treaties, and there was quite a lot of resistance, and it became difficult. So corporations have figured out that by narrowing it a bit, doing regional and even just bilateral treaties, they can push through more. So fundamentally, what came out of the WTO was a process that took us in the direction of big banks and corporations having more and more power, a process of suing governments if they didn't get their way. And so the only difference really is that these are now regional rather than globally multilateral treaties.
Right. So the next question is, are you familiar with the modern monetary theory approach to economics? The questioner mentions that Stephanie Kelton is a leader and that they offer an alternative to austerity economic policy. Are either of you familiar with that?
Familiar with that? Are you, Stephanie?
No, I'm not. I'm not familiar. I just know degrowth and let's. That's all I know.
What was the name? What was the name again?
It was
of that person?
Yeah, modern monetary theory, shortened to MMT.
Yeah. And who was the person? I'm going to look it up.
Sure, that's so Stephanie Kelton is a leader in that, apparently. Yeah, and here we go. Yeah, so Chuck, who asked the question, says that MMT criticizes the debt policies of the EU and America.
But it's great to hear that. It shows that more and more people disagree with the EU's policy. Maybe it would be interesting to look into this and maybe organize a webinar with that person to learn more about it. I'd love to learn more about it.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, in fact, I think we should organize a webinar, but it would be broader than that because there are so many different suggestions for a different way of doing it. And this is one of them. I actually believe that it would be simpler, rather than thinking up something, as it were, completely new. And here they're talking about the government issuing tokens as the unit of money. There is no reason why the government can't be in charge of issuing money. So I would prefer, I think, the suggestions of Ellen Brown, who's a colleague of ours, and who you can find on the web. She's promoting what she calls public banking, that we need to have the nation state very much under the pressure from their voters, from the citizens, who now will be able, they've got to have accountable, visible structures if there's to be any chance that the citizen is going to have real power and be able to vote on what they prefer in terms of economic choices. So once there is that citizen pressure, no reason why we can't have public banking in the public interest. And we don't need government issued tokens would be in effect the same thing as government issued money. So there's probably an overlap here in the thinking of these people.
Yeah, and Chuck just said that.
Brown.
Yeah, he just said in the chat that Ellen Brown is very familiar with MMT economics. So probably there is overlap and yeah.
Overlap. Good.
So the next question is about agricultural subsidies. So the question reads, subsidies in agriculture in Japan are promoting increasing farm sizes. Is there a need for citizens to shape agricultural policy and subsidies that promote local agriculture?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And in fact, in almost every country, governments are subsidizing agriculture, meaning subsidizing the large to get even bigger, subsidizing them to promote bigger monocultures for export, rather than diversifying production for home need as a priority. I'm sure, Stephanie, you have something to say about that too. Definitely we need this shift, and this is part of what Via Campesina promotes, what they call food sovereignty, the right to prioritize food for home needs first and for export as a second priority. It's so important for us to realize that the only thing that human beings produce that we all need every single day of our lives is food. Nothing else that we absolutely need that's produced by humans. And yet this activity has been relegated to a side issue. Farmers have been subjected to insane economic thinking, which has pressured them to industrialize, meaning to produce potatoes and apples and bananas in the same way that we produce rubber balls or cannonballs. In other words, standard size for the standard machinery, for what washes, what transports, the supermarket shelf. It's unbelievably inefficient. It's linked to, the monocultures are completely unnatural, so that then leads to a demand for pesticides, herbicides, etc. From beginning to end, it's inefficient and wasteful. Tons of food are also burned and destroyed because they don't fit into these standard sizes and shapes. So absolutely, we need people to wake up to the need to pressure government for a dramatic turnaround.
If you look at, so first of all, I want to make the connection or to explain the relationship between subsidies and free trade treaties. So the free trade treaties will not have a direct impact on subsidies because each and every country, or how shall we say, the US as well as the EU, feels very protective about their subsidies. So they are not relinquishing any of that. But of course, there is a general trend, and the trend for sure is that with more global trade in agricultural goods, the governments hope that they will be able to lower agricultural subsidies and hence use that money for other purposes. And in the EU, you have to imagine this is quite a lot of money. In the EU, 40% of the EU's total annual budget goes for agriculture and subsidies. So this is quite a lot of money. And if we look at what these subsidies have produced, these subsidies are given on the size of your farm or on the amount that you produce. So the bigger you are and the more you produce, the more subsidies you get. And this already fuels something that we can call industrial farming, because it means you get recompensated the bigger and the fatter you are as a farmer. And this has shaped the look of farms in Europe. what is very sad about it is that instead of producing quality food and instead of recompensating the farmers that look after the earth and that feed the earth and that really farm, like farm managers, you are recompensating those that I would say plunder the earth, that make the earth dead and just put pesticides in it. And I don't know how it is in the US and in Japan. It would be really interesting to hear, but we have in Germany and in Austria, we have something that we call the death of the farms. And you can, I mean, each day in Austria, 6 farms close because they cannot compete with the bigger farms, and they cannot compete they cannot compete because they are small farms and they don't get enough subsidies, and the big farms get all the big subsidies and they cannot compete with them anymore. And then of course if the price then gets lowered and lowered, because you also have imports, cheap imports because of TTIP and things like this, then for farming it will be, for small farmers it will be very difficult to survive, if not impossible.
So I think we have time for one.
So important.
Yeah.
Go
ahead, Helena.
I just want to make a comment that our global industrializing economy is destroying small farms literally now by the million, because we're talking about this huge shift in China, in India, in Africa, where people are being pulled into megalopolis cities to produce in big sweatshop-like factories. And even there, unemployment is skyrocketing as millions of farmers pour into these cities. You know, around Beijing is something like 50 million people crowding together with 20 satellite cities. So it's a disastrous direction. And the good news is that people are waking up and rebuilding local food economies, even in China. It's not happening on the same scale that the other trend is, but it is happening. So I hope that hearing the big global picture doesn't make people feel overwhelmed or that it's too big. Personally, I feel very encouraged by the changes that are happening. But please join us in becoming what I call a big picture activist. You know, you can, even if you can't be out demonstrating on the street, you can keep sending out the emails, keep letting your voice be heard, sign on to the petitions. Please help yourself and others wake up. We have the power, we really do. We have the numbers. We just have to be aware that what we're getting in the media is not just half truth. A lot of it is not lies, but it is such a distorted picture that it becomes untrue, even though, you know, it's so you have to consciously find and seek out sources of information that come from the truth, that come from the ground, that come from people's experience, and not from an expertise that is completely out of touch with what's happening to our seeds, to our soils, to our farmers, to our jobs, to our identity. There is a lot of information there, and there are so many positive stories that will inspire you. So I hope we can convince you to join us. And I think we need to say goodbye for now. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us. We should probably do this again because we have a lot to talk about.
Helena, you have to tell the people to come out onto the streets. Come on! It's important.
Yes, do. But even if you can't, please send out the messages.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much work to do before that. Yeah.
And thank you also for all the questions to everybody. I'm sorry I couldn't reply to all of them. But I've learned a lot from you today, so thank you very much for your questions and for all your contributions.